que nos va a contar sobre la concentración, sobre la tasa natural. Dale, Robert, you can do it in English, of course, and that's completely fine.
Okay, thanks for having me. This is my first ever paper that comes with the disclaimer that these are our views, not the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's, which is where Andrew and Trent both are. So the question that we have is the natural rate of interest. I'll give you a kind of formal definition of what it is in our model later, but you might think of it as what would the real interest rate be if the central bank didn't exist, or something like that. If you want to know that, so you can think about, are we setting the real rate high or low relative to what it would otherwise be? So the evidence for New Zealand suggests that this real rate of interest, this natural rate of interest, has fallen over the past few decades. It's now lower than it used to be. The bank already has a whole series of statistical models to try and estimate what is the actual natural rate of interest. In this paper, we're not trying to say what it is. We'll have an answer to that, but that's not really what we're after because that's already done by all the statistical models. Instead, we're about building a model to say what is driving the changes in the natural rate of interest, which is, we want to kind of talk about why has it decreased. So we're going to have 6 potential drivers in our model as reasons that the natural rate of interest could have decreased. One of them, because New Zealand is a small country, population 5 million, is the world natural rate of interest. So New Zealand's interest rates are kind of generally going up and down with the bigger economies in the world. The second one is population growth. The third one is productivity growth. The fourth one is government debt levels. The fifth, old age labour force participation. New Zealand, among the OECD countries, has one of the highest rates of employment for people aged 65 to 75. So we want to think about, does that matter? And longevity, people are living longer.
There are already models that compute the natural interest rate, natural rate of interest. Do any of these models have these variables, or they come from a completely separate?
So there's kind of 2 literatures on the natural rate of interest. One is all of those statistical models trying to say what it is, and the other one are all overlapping generation models, kind of similar to what we're doing here. In those, most of them are closed economy, so they're not thinking about number 1. Pretty much all of them have number 2 and number 3 and number 4. Number 5, I don't think anyone else has done. Number 6, pretty much all of them have. So we have some of the main ones, and I'll talk about the things that some have that we don't as well later on. So there are 2 or 3 other things I could put on the list here that we've decided not to put in. And I'll talk about what those are and why we've not put them in. But so most models will be a closed economy model. So number 1 here is obviously not there, but we're not the first to put number 1 in. And number 5, nobody else, I think, has done. But I wouldn't say that's a massive change.
And you're talking about the concept of like long term, right?
We're just going to have the equilibrium rate in the model. I'll tell you exactly what that is in terms of an equilibrium concept, which is kind of getting to what you're saying with the long term and the short term.
Can you develop, for instance, what we understand by old age labor? It's people that.
So in the model, it's just going to be the percentage of people ages 65 to 80 that are working.
Yeah. And the sigma.
The 6th one, longevity. People know that they have a certain probability of dying, and so they have an expectation about how long they're going to live. And the idea in the model is if you think you're going to live longer, you're going to spend more time in retirement, you should save more money for your retirement so there are more assets and a lower natural rate of interest as a result. Right? Obviously, the longevity and the population growth interact, right? As people live longer, the population gets older as well.
Can I understand longevity, like at the moment when I burn, the expectancy of how?
So in the model, it's just going to be the probability that you survive to the next period. So it's exactly a conditional survival probability.
Okay. I have a question about the first one. If you're going to consider as like a small open economy
Yep.
where you're gonna have a relationship between the local
domestic and the
interest
foreign.
rate with the world natural interest rate. Isn't it, you're gonna claim something about the relative importance of all of these facts relative to the other ones? Because some people have this intuition that we as small open economies should take into account just the global interest rates and plus something, and that's our natural rate. You're gonna say
So this is very much jumping ahead, but our answer is going to be two of these matter a lot. One of them is the world and the other one's the productivity. So one is international and one is domestic. That's essentially the result. There's obviously a lot more before we finally get to it. But yeah, international and domestic, one of each were the two most important.
Right. Just is there any reason for why focusing on these drivers and not others? For instance, the increasing inequality.
So that's one that I'll explain later when we get to it why we don't do that. But that's exactly one of the ones that some people do that we don't, and I'll explain exactly why we don't do it when later on.
There are also other factors that pop in my mind, like market power, increasing risk aversion, things that actually direct fundings to safe assets that decrease interest rate value.
Yeah, no, this is certainly not an exhaustive list. We have, other than convenience yield, we have what are thought by the literature to be probably the main ones, right? Inequality is thought to be one, maybe, depending on the country and the time period. But I'll explain why we don't want to do that one in here. Okay, so how do we go about doing this? We build a small open economy overlapping generations model. The equilibrium interest rate in the model is what we'll refer to as the natural rate. So that's the model concept that we're going to use. In this model, households make consumption savings decisions. In terms of how it relates to the world interest rate, we're going to have the interest rate differential, which is the New Zealand natural rate of interest minus the world natural rate of interest, is related to the net foreign position. Essentially, there'll be an elasticity, and that's how the two follow each other around, but they're not the same rate. They can differ because this differential can change. We're going to have asset markets. Domestic people are going to save a bunch of money. New Zealand runs current account deficits every year for the past 30 years. So New Zealand's a net from the rest of the world. So we also have this negative net foreign position is the source of assets. So there's both domestic savings and that negative net foreign position are the sources of assets in the economy. And there are two uses for those. One of them is physical capital. One of them is government debt. The model period's going to be, it's right on time, isn't it? It's about Model period is annual, and what we're going to solve is repeated transition paths. And I'll explain a bit later exactly what that is, but essentially every year there's a new transition path of what people think is going to happen, and then some combination of those is what ends up happening. The way that this works then, we've got those 6 drivers that I showed you on the previous slide. Those kind of just become 6 parameters in the model. Lots of them depend on age, so it's a lot more than 6, but let's just pretend it's 6 parameters in the model. We follow the data for how those 6 parameters change over time, and then we solve the model to get what is the natural rate of interest over time. Then what we're going to do is repeatedly solve the model, turning the drivers on and off to say which drivers matter for the path of natural rate of interest that we see. Okay, so our core findings, the main drivers were declining productivity growth at a lower world natural rate of interest. In the middle, having some role, but not an important one, for the slowing population growth, which will break down into newborns and migration and increased longevity. And then the two that were unimportant, government debt and old age labour force participation, they're not doing 0, but you'll see later they're doing a tiny amount. The government debt result differs from a lot of papers in literature, so it's worth pointing out that part of this is the government debt in New Zealand just doesn't change that much over this period. The whole time it's between 20 and 40% of GDP. Papers that are finding the government debt to matter are often looking at countries where it's gone, say the US or Spain, where it is something like 40 or 60% of GDP through to 100, 120% of GDP. So the movements in the So the movements in the government debt are much bigger in the countries where they find that it matters. In New Zealand, the movements in the government debt are just not big enough to matter.
But if you apply this or to another country, or if so suddenly it becomes important, like for the future, it will be important.
If we had a big movement in the government debt, it would be important.
About productivity growth, since this is a small open economy, this should be like the differential productivity growth, reflected through foreign asset position.
The rest of the world in this economy is an interest rate, and that's it. So we don't have a productivity differential that's interacting. You're right, if we had sort of two countries set up, we'd have to think about how the productivity in the other country also changed the net foreign position and therefore drove the interest rate differential.
Yes, because I was thinking about something like, maybe we can talk about this after the presentation, but maybe like there's something like a real exchange rate there. Natural real exchange rate that is driven by productivity growth, for example, and and you have another start there, like the interest rate and the exchange rate, and
so we
something about that.
We avoid the exchange rate completely, essentially, in our setup. There is no exchange rate.
Real, but the real exchange rate can be something interesting to look at.
Yep. Well, I'll come later to how our open economy thing works and talk a bit more about it then. Okay, so the takeaway is New Zealand's natural rate of interest going to stay low? Yes, if you think the low productivity and the lower world rate are here to stay, and no, if you think those are going to change. But one of the things we wanted to highlight is that we found both the domestic and international factors mattering as our two main drivers of the fall. Okay, so for the rest of the day, I'm just going to say that, but with a lot more detail of what exactly is in the model, what exactly we're doing in all the steps. The data we have, anything in New Zealand in macroeconomics, you go back to start of the 1990s, end of the 1990s, because that's where the data begins. So in our case here, we're starting from the year 2000. That's the earliest we can do with the data that we have. Okay. You're probably not particularly interested in exactly what the New Zealand interest rate is, but what I'm doing here is just showing you that downward trend. So I'm just plotting, I'm not attempting to plot the natural rate of interest here. This is just the ex post real rate. There's a nominal rate minus what inflation turned out to be after the fact. You can see there's a downward trend over this period of 2000 to 2024. Every theory of the natural rate of interest says that over longer periods of time, it has to kind of be around the average of this, right? So any theory of the natural rate of interest, I could plot various measures that RBNZ has of the natural rate of interest. They'd all have this downward trend. They differ a lot in the details of exactly what's doing, of exactly where it is at any point in time, but they're all going to show this downward trend. Just another thing, because you're probably all not familiar with the data, over this period, the inflation's like 1 to 2% all the way through, except for those last couple of years, right? And it spikes up and maxes out at something like 8%, I think was what it peaked at.
Well, do you have an idea of the evolution of the NPK, or let's say the interest rate of productive capital?
So there is no measure of the marginal product of capital for New Zealand. That's something I'll come back and talk to. Like I'll talk to that specifically when we come to, we want to do an extension that's not done yet, where we're specifically trying to make the public and the private differ.
I'm asking this because I remember this paper that there's a kind of tension in the sense that in this type of natural rate
the model is a marginal product of capital, but the interest is a natural rate of interest.
Yeah.
The object of interest is the natural rate of interest. Yeah.
And also because you have said that one of the main drivers is productivity. So if at the end of the day, productivity is the main driver, this should reflect also that the MPK or the interest rates of other type of assets. Risky assets also.
So that
go down.
Okay, let me just fill in everybody else in the room. But there's two things in reality. One is the return to capital, and the other one is the real interest, the natural rate of interest. The empirical evidence suggests that the return to capital is fairly flat, down a little bit, but mostly flat, and the natural rate of interest is down a lot. This model, like every other OLG model like every other structural model in the literature, is just setting the natural rate of interest equal to the marginal product of capital. That's how all the models work. Now I'll come back at the end and talk about an extension we're working on to let the two differ. But in what I'm doing here, the two numbers are the same in the model, but everybody's well aware that they're different in reality, right? The evidence in New Zealand, we don't actually have any evidence on what is the marginal product of capital. Nobody's calculated it, but based on all the other countries, it should be not falling nearly as much as the natural rate of interest. But we won't have. I'll have hypothetical things to say about it, but nothing concrete. But it's a problem with every OLG model, which is every structural model in this literature, that they just set the natural rate of interest to be the marginal product of capital. Okay, so what is the natural rate of interest? We, like everybody else, follow Wixel, I think it's like 1938 or something, who says that the real short-term interest rate consistent with output equaling its natural rate and constant inflation is the definition of the natural rate of interest. Note that this is not the same thing as the neutral rate of interest, which is just the interest rate that would have inflation neither increase or decrease. As I mentioned before, RBNZ already has lots of models that are mostly statistical econometric models to think about what the natural and neutral rates of interest are. So our contribution in this paper is not really what is the actual rate, it's why has it fallen. So these are the 6 potential drivers again. As I said in the model, we're actually going to split population into newborns. I put the newborns in quotes because the youngest people in the model are 20-year-olds. So they're new 20-year-olds, but I'm calling them newborns. And migration. So our 6 drivers again, world natural rate of interest, population growth, productivity growth, government debt levels, old age labour force participation, longevity. This is the path for the 6 drivers. So as I said, the way that this paper works, you collect data on your 6 drivers, you solve the model to get a path for the interest rate, and then you can turn the drivers on and off and get the alternate counterfactual paths, and that's how you decompose the thing. So what are the 6 drivers? What do they look like in the data? The world natural rate falls. The population growth goes up and down a bunch. This is the growth of the 20-year-olds, I should say. It's not the growth of the whole population of New Zealand, it's the change in 20-year-olds. The part over here, it's very easy if you're a New Zealander. You have full rights to move to Australia and get a job. So what's happening at the end here is lots of people who are about 20 are moving to Australia to find a job. The population of the country was growing, but the population of 20-year-olds shrunk. The productivity growth was higher, now lower. The government debt to GDP, as I said, it does move around, but it's pretty much 20 to 40% of GDP. So by the standards of many other countries over this period, it really doesn't move much. And that's going to be an important part of why we find it to be unimportant. The labour force participation, as you can see, the 65 to 69-year-olds work a lot more in New Zealand than they used to be, and a lot more than in most other OECD countries. Similarly, with the 70 to 80-year-olds are also working a lot longer than they used to be. You can kind of see these lines shifting up to the right, which is telling you people are living longer.
Sorry, if I understood your exercise correctly, you're assuming in the model that these are all exogenous, right?
Yep, exactly.
Government debt is.
Yep.
Okay.
So these will just be parameters that we feed in that are exactly this. And then when we do the counterfactual, you essentially just replace that line with the calibration value, which is what we used when we set up the model in 2000 to 2005. So they just all turn into these gray lines when you turn them off.
But it could be the case that some of these objects are endogenously determined.
Oh, they're definitely all endogenously determined. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so things that we don't have as drivers in this model that are somewhere else in the literature, why are they not here, or why might you want to put them in? So one of them is inequality. We thought a bunch about this. We're going to have two types of agent. One's low income and one's high income. We decided we didn't really want to try and do the inequality. And the reason was based on the mechanism in the model would be that increased income inequality leads to increased wealth inequality, leads to more assets, leads to a lower return on the assets, which is a fall in the natural rate of interest. But we know for analytically proven that this class of models can't generate realistic wealth inequality. What do I mean by that? Analytically, we know, or empirically, what you see in the data, if you look at income data distributions, you see a tail that's a fat tail. But then when you look at the wealth distribution, you see a fatter tail than you saw for the income distribution. So this paper by Stahersky and Toda, they prove that this class of models, the wealth distribution has a thinner tail than the income distribution. So we know that this model is not going to get the wealth distribution right. And we preferred to say nothing about how inequality did it than to give a number that we felt would be wrong anyway. That's pretty much the reason. Not a great reason, right? Kind of like a model that does inequality better. But that was our reasoning for not doing that, is we don't trust the answer this model would give anyway, because it's going to get the wealth to be less unequal than the income. Idiosyncratic shocks, we don't put them in because papers that put them in tend to find they're not very important. It would also be a major complication of the model, because then you'd have, if you didn't change the model to Epstein's in preferences, you'll have one parameter for the elasticity of intertemporal substitution and the risk aversion. And the elasticity of intertemporal substitution in this model is hugely important. It's pretty much one of the three parameters that determine the interest rate, or three most important parameters. So we didn't want to get, looking at the literature, it didn't seem to be that important. They all find that it doesn't matter, so we don't bother with it. Investment-specific technological change. You can do this in the model. You just switch out the production function. Papers that do it, there's a whole series of 3 papers with Rana Sacchetti on there. And what she finds in their most recent one is it's not an important. Here they're looking at global R-star. We also don't have the data in New Zealand on what is the relative price of capital. So given that other studies were finding it unimportant, we felt that it wasn't worth trying to calculate the whole series for a relative price of capital just to put it in the model when we didn't think it would do anything anyway. Lastly, convenience yield. So this last one is about the natural rate of interest and the marginal product of capital are different, right? Or also, in the data, people will look at how much lower the interest rate is on treasuries than on safe corporates, and there's quite a substantial spread there. Convenience yield is standing in place of things like a liquidity premium, a risk premium, a term premium, some combination of those. That's what the convenience yield refers to. I'll come and talk about the extension that we're doing to try and capture at least a little bit of this. All that I'll say on it for now is it's not in any of the other models in the literature either. But we've come to the conclusion that this is the biggest weakness of the approach that we have, is not having this distinction in there. And I'll talk about with the extension what we are trying to do to at least get something of it. Okay, time for the model. We built a small open economy overlapping generations model. In the model, capital market equilibrium means that the natural rate of interest equals the marginal product of capital. This comes because we've got perfect competition and a Cobb-Douglas production function. So as a result, anything that's going to change aggregate capital or labor is going to change the interest rate. Before I jump into the model with all the equations, I just want to try and give an intuition for what's determining the interest rate in this model. So first is how we relate the interest rate differential to the net foreign position. I'll show you the equation later, but essentially what happens is the size of the net foreign position is going to be proportional to the interest rate differential. What it means is it's like saying when the interest rate differential is higher, more capital or less capital is flowing. Yeah, capital will flow into New Zealand to try and reduce it. That's the kind of idea that it's trying to give. So we have a net foreign position related to an interest rate differential. And then that net foreign position, where that equals the net demand and supply of assets domestically, is where we find the domestic interest rate. So this domestic demand and supply of assets is kind of what I described before. Of the supply is household savings, and the demand is you can either use it as physical capital or as government debt. So in our model, what's going to happen is there's going to be household savings. We know the net foreign position is negative. So we then add that to the household savings, the amount of money that New Zealand borrows from the rest of the world, and we can use that for a combination of physical capital and government debt. And where those two balance, that's what's determining our interest rate. The role of the international interest rate is that it changes the net foreign position because it changes the differential to our own. Okay. So each of our factors, then we can think about how a change in any of our factors is going to change the natural rate of interest. They're all effectively working by changing the supply or demand for assets in New Zealand, right? So everything in the model works by changing the supply and demand of assets in New Zealand, and then therefore changing the natural rate of interest. There's a little bit of action because it's also the labour supply will matter, but almost everything comes from changes in the amount of assets in the economy. Okay, I'm going to jump into the equations now. It's a fairly standard OLG model other than the small open economy part. So there's going to be a household problem, a firm problem. You take aggregates of them, and then you have market clearance, general equilibrium conditions. The model period's annual. I'm going to drop all the time subscripts, because otherwise everything gets a bit crazy. Just to mention, in the first paper, we had a 5-year time period in the model. I'm not going to show you results from that paper, but it kind of, when we built the model the first time and did the intuition, we did that. We just did stationary equilibria. Now we're in a second paper where we've switched it to annual. So people are going to be born at age 20. They can live as long as 99, although most of them will die before that. There's a probability every year that you survive one further year. There's going to be 2 permanent types, low income and high income. As I said, we decided not to really do inequality, so we have a very small amount of it, but a very small amount. Households have deterministic income, so there's going to be a hump-shaped earnings over their lifetime, and they're going to make consumption savings decisions. Their labour supply is exogenous. What we decided with the labour supply is we'd rather do that thing about getting older age people to work more than to endogenize this. So we decided that was the preferred option from our perspective, at least. At a certain age, they're going to start receiving pensions, and when they're even older still, they'll start leaving bequests. So survival probabilities, so there's a probability they survive from today to tomorrow, and progressive taxes are in there as well, so that we get a roughly correct size of government for New Zealand.
Why do you, if you're not going to be focusing on inequality, why do you need 2 types of households? Something to do with hand to mouth, or
to have a reasonable amount of assets relative to income, roughly. So that, maybe we needed it, maybe we didn't. We just kind of wanted a reasonable amount of assets relative to income. We thought 2 permanent types would help that, rather than only playing with the patients to try and hit it.
In the previous slide, so the pensions they receive is only what their own savings. There's no direct.
Sorry, there is a pension. I'll show you in the next slide. There is a pension that you get from the government, and in New Zealand, it's a universal pension to everyone that is completely disconnected from what you did in the rest of your life.
Yeah, okay.
So this is the New Zealand law for both the tax system and the pensions, right? There's a pension that you receive. It's conditional on your age, but it is not conditional on your working status. And that's part of the reason why we can see in New Zealand quite a lot of older people continuing to work. They are all receiving a pension, but they're still allowed to work if they want to at no penalty to their pension. It's slightly changed. It bumps you slightly into the upper tax brackets, but there's no like specific thing on the pension that says you do or don't work in exchange for receiving your pension. You just get it at a certain age.
And there is a channel through the public debt in the fiscal. I mean,
The way it's going to work in the model, because we want to hit the path of government debt, we're just going to adjust the government spending that's not really doing anything in the model to hit that path, given what's happening to taxes. That's how it's going to function in practice. So there is a government budget constraint, but the debt just follows the data. Right? We don't kind of use the taxes and the spending to think about what debt is. We use taxes and what the debt is in the data to think about what the spending has to be. That's how the model works.
Is this pension too small or something? Why are there people still working when they're 18? Is it super small or?
It's, if you are lower income New Zealander, it's going to be quite a high rate of replacement. If you're a middle income New Zealander, it'll be quite a low rate of replacement. But there is no, people still want some more money, I guess. Hospital bills. No, I don't know. I can't tell you why they're still working, but there's no explicit penalty of any kind for continuing to work while receiving the pension. So the taxable income changes a bit at everything. This gamma J is just so that we can change the old age labour force participation rate. But people's earnings follows a hump shape that's exogenous. They have some assets that they get interest on. People aged between 40 and 65 receive bequests and nobody else does. We looked at the New Zealand data and that's roughly the ages of people receiving bequests. So like many OLG models, there are a lot of accidental bequests that we redistribute, but in our model, we only redistribute them to specific ages that we chose to roughly match the data. Right, so we take all the accidental bequests and then average them across everybody who's aged 40 to 65. Because we want to hit the bequest to GDP ratio, we have some annuities in here for the people who are between retirement before they start leaving bequests that just scale R up for the fact that they might die. So people who are over JE are the ones who leave the bequests, and then the 40 to 65-year-olds are the ones who receive them. The actual model, if you ignore all the bit about taxes, which is these top 4 lines, is pretty simple. You have some income from exogenous earnings and the interest that you receive on your assets. Plus, you might get some bequests. You have some savings, and you can use that for 2 things. You can consume it, or you can save it for next period. Right? So it's just an exogenous labour supply life cycle model. And if you ignore all the stuff about taxes and bequests, it's a fairly simple standard. Okay. The firm is going to be a representative firm with Cobb Douglas production, and we assume perfect competition. What this means is that R is the marginal product of capital, which if you take the derivative of that with respect to K, that's the marginal product of capital, right? So it'll be like alpha K, alpha minus 1, ZL1 minus alpha is R. That's what R is in the model that we're calling the natural rate of interest. W is the marginal product of labour. Then we have government. It gets revenue from a variety of taxes that we've got to be roughly the same size relative to GDP as in the New Zealand data. And it spends it on 2 things. One is pension and the other one is G-spend. G-spend effectively disappears from the model and is just used to get our path on, to fit our path on government debt. In New Zealand, there is one budget for the pensions and all the other government spending. So this is how the government's budget does work in New Zealand, is we just have one big combined. but just. And then there's two other things we need for general equilibrium, or a couple of other things we need for general equilibrium. We need the bequests to balance. We actually have different bequests for the high income and low income households. So assets left behind by high income households go to high income households, and same for the low income. We don't lump them in together. We have that asset market clearance, that the domestic assets with the net foreign position, because this is negative, can be used for two purposes: private capital and government debt. And then this is the equation for our relationship between the interest rates. If you think about taking the log of it, that says domestic interest rate equals foreign interest rate plus a constant, and then reacting to the net foreign position as a percentage of GDP. So those are our general equilibrium equations. It ends up as 6. This one can be kind of imposed. Okay, so that's the model. Largely, it's a simple exogenous labor supply OLG model, and then a bunch of these about taxes and transfers in there, and we get all of our drivers into it. And of course, the thing gets renormalized to remove all the productivity and the population growth. We calibrate the model stationary equilibrium to the New Zealand data for the year 2000. Some of the main things that we're targeting here, we're getting the life cycle profile of mean earnings, we're getting the capital output ratio. If you think about the formula for the interest rate here, R equals the marginal product of capital, it essentially tells you two things matter for R. One is alpha, which is the capital share of income, and the other one is the capital output ratio. So we get them both to target the data and try to get K over Y and alpha to be roughly correct. Alpha, by the way, the capital share of income in New Zealand's pretty high. It's actually 41, 42%, substantially higher than most countries. We try to get bequests to be roughly the right size of GDP. We try to make all the tax revenue roughly the right size as GDP. We just follow the statutory progressive tax rates. The New Zealand, the statutory and effective are actually very close. And then we're targeting a bunch of ratios to GDP. If anyone wants specifically to see parameter values, tell me and I'll click that button, but otherwise I'm going to go past them. There's a lot of parameters and it's not worth just showing a massive list of them. I'll talk later about the ones that we find matter the most.
Sorry, this interest rate with respect to the net foreign position, how do you that those?
So we just take calibrations from the literature for that. We don't specifically try to target. That's one of the things that we're thinking about that should be improved. But yeah, I forget exactly what the number is. It's something like sigma equals 2 or 1.4, but we just take it from the literature. We couldn't find a New Zealand-based paper that's estimating it directly. So for now, it's just a standard pre-calibration value.
I see. I wonder if your results are very sensitive to it.
They are, and I'll show you that. There's the three. This is jumping ahead. 3 parameters matter to the results: beta, the discount factor; sigma, which was the CES utility parameter because it determines the elasticity of intertemporal substitution; and phi2, which was that thing that's the elasticity of the net foreign position to the interest rate differential. We resolved the model, changing all the parameters up and down like a certain amount, one parameter by one, and those are the 3 parameters that are important here. Everything else is it'll change a bit, but nothing major. But those are the 3 parameters that matter. Okay, so in our first paper, we just we updated the drivers and just solved stationary equilibrium every period. This was a bit basic. It's kind of like saying the infinite future just comes into the present, right? Most of the literature, essentially the entire literature, what they do is they solve one transition path. I personally dislike this because what you're saying is people in the year 2000 are going to know exactly the next 24 years, and people in the year 2024 don't even know next year. And I really didn't like that as a solution thing. To be clear, I'm not against single transition paths if you're doing a hypothetical counterfactual or what's happening in the future. But here with a historical decomposition, we didn't like it. We didn't really want to do it. So what we end up doing, we found there's one paper, Cesar Bianchi, Harrison, and Sargetti, and they do a new idea, which is repeated transition paths, which is every period, every year, we update our expectations for the drivers and solve the transition path that corresponds to that. And then next period, we'll update our forecasts for the drivers again and solve the corresponding transition. So what that means in our case is we're going to have 25 transition paths. I say I'll talk later about how the forecasts are made. I'll say it now. We have a more complicated thing in here, but we now find, and the result that I'm going to show you is the more complicated forecast. But actually, you can just think about it. We get essentially the same result. People believe that the driver will equal its average of the last 5 years. So when they want to think what is productivity growth going to end up, they take the last 5 years productivity growth, they average that, and they say that's where productivity growth is going to end up. And then you know what productivity growth is today, you have your forecast what it's going to be in the infinite future, and you have exponential decay into that. So they do that for all of the drivers, except for the ones on survival probabilities. We felt everybody knows society's aging. They have perfect foresight on those. So I'll talk about sensitivity of the forecasts a little bit later. Okay. So we do all of this to give you an idea. The model has like 80 odd periods, and then a transition path is 100 time periods, and we solve all 25 of them in roughly 4 hours. Right. There's 2 tricks, but unless any of you particularly want to know about how to solve transition path over G6, I'll skip them. So this is the answer we get. If you look at pretty much every structural paper in the literature, they will have done one of 2 things. Either they've subtracted a constant from this, or this is 0 and it's the change, which is what I'll do on the next graph. But I just wanted to have one slide here to point out essentially what you said at the beginning. The marginal product of capital is not the interest rate, right? This is the marginal product of capital, but in New Zealand, that alpha, that shift, the capital share of income is quite high. We get pretty large numbers, but even if you drop it to a number like 0.3 for something like the US, you're still going to get substantially larger numbers than we think that the natural rate of interest is. So that is our path for the natural rate of interest from 2000 to 2024. Now you can see I fixed up the axis, right? I just made it a change from what it was originally. This light red line is what people thought the interest rate was going to be given their forecasts in that year. And then we go to the next year and they make a new forecast, and then we go to the next year and they make a new forecast. So you can see also that prior to the Great Recession, everybody's kind of thinking that the natural rate will stay up at this level and then it drops down there. I can't tell you exactly why. I think it's the lower productivity growth that's hitting, but we're going to do some decompositions about exactly what causes this drop. For now, we just have a drop. But this is giving you that, what is the repeated transition path? You solve one and then you kind of take one step along the path that you thought was going to happen, and then you start into a new one.
So,
Yep.
Is there a jump in 2020? Is there?
No, I don't think so.
So the shock in 2020 seemed to be more transitory, or is it?
I guess it would be. I guess if we look at the drivers, maybe if we go back to the drivers for a second, there's probably not much movement in the drivers in 2020, and then you're not going to get a lot of. If there's not a lot of movement in the drivers, you're not going to get a lot of movement in the. Right. You can see the world rate falls a lot here, back at that one where we had that big drop suddenly, whereas there's not a big shift in it here. There's some shift in the population, but I think it's more of a trend that's going through it. So I guess, yeah, the drivers don't jump. That one does a bit, but that one we've already said is not very important by magnitude anyway. So there's just not jumps in our drivers in 2020, and so we can't get a jump in our interest rate in 2020.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yep.
Do you hear me? All right. I was wondering how relevant or how important is this repeated transition paths for the results? What would be the results be if you assume perfect foresight, or if you say assume, I don't know, an R2 process instead of that 5-year average for the forecast of the agents?
So I'll talk about some other forecasts that we've tried out, and the answer is they don't make much difference. I'll come to that. We're coming to that shortly in a robustness section. What does it look like if you just do one transition path instead of the repeated transition paths? I don't have our version of that graph with me. It does look different. If you look in that, there's a Bianchi, Harrison, and Sargetti paper. They have both graphs, and you can see quite a substantial difference between the two, between the one transition path and the repeated transition paths. But I don't have our version of that graph handy, but they are different, is all I can say, sorry.
Thanks.
If you were to give an advice to the board of a central bank, for example, would you say that you can do a mapping between this interest rate and the removal rate that they would follow? Or
if
not?
you ask me to say,
would you need the interest rate?
Kind of do I trust my model? I trust my model on what the drivers are.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly wouldn't ask my model what the natural rate is.
So would you say that it fell a lot during this period?
But we have other evidence that's like that graph I showed you of the interest rates at the start, and all of the statistical estimators all have it falling over that period in a magnitude not dissimilar from this. But I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the exact magnitudes here. I think we can improve that, especially essentially coming back to this thing about marginal product of capital versus interest rate, right? Yeah, I personally am happy with the importance of the drivers, but you know, we saw it in this slide. You can't ask it what the rate is. That's for sure. If you look at the literature on structural models, you'll see they all show this axis, not that axis, because it doesn't look good. Okay, so we do that once and we get that path. We can do it 6 more times, turning the drivers on and off, and we get 6 more paths, and then we can compare the differences. And that gives us this. The black line is that path we saw before. And then you'll see there's 7 because I've split population into the growth of the 20-year-olds and the migration. But then there's our drivers. Because the solution's not linear, these 6 won't add up to 100%. And that's what this gray at the top is with the interactions, that the non-linearities and the the interaction terms between the 6 drivers are that gray part at the top. So those do matter also, it should be pointed out. We've got 2 main drivers. You can see the pink and the purple are certainly bigger than everything else. The pink is the productivity growth, that slowdown in productivity growth, causing the interest rate to fall, and the reduction in the world natural rate, causing the interest rate to fall. So domestic and international factors both being important here. Next, 2 mild drivers. The population growth, which is the migration and the population growth, and the government debt, so kind of the blues and the greenish. They're doing something, right? But they're not big players in anything that's happening here. So they're not irrelevant, but they're not major drivers of what's going on. It's all mostly the population, the productivity and the world natural rate that are mattering here. And lastly, these 2 tiny little things in here, government debt and old age stable false participation. So they're not really doing anything, either of the 2. Okay, so let's talk about a bunch of robustness tests. I said we do a forecast. This is still based on what our current one, which I just showed you, is, which is a quite complicated forecasting. But if you switch it to a 5-year moving average, it's essentially the same graph. So we're going to change the paper because this is quite complicated to explain, and it's a total waste of my time when I can just say 5-year moving average. This will go to an obscure appendix.
Something I missed, I think, you have the interest rate as an input. Any interest rate, or it's just
the world natural? Oh, sorry. So what do we use as the data on the world natural interest rate? We use the Holstrom-Laubach-Williams estimates for the US.
No, but for New Zealand, you don't use the interest rate.
The interest rate is an equilibrium concept. We have 6 drivers that are exogenous, and we change those over time, and then the model solving gives us the equilibrium interest rate in each time period. Okay, so our original forecast is a rough rule inspired by concepts like rational inattention and noise versus signal. Roughly, you do use the average of the last few periods, but you only update your average if the new data is surprising, which is measured by like the variance of the old data and how many standard deviations away from it your new data is. So the idea was that this was going to get some inertia and jumps, but it doesn't really do anything versus the 5-year rolling average. So that's going to become the standard. We also tried a unit root, which is just you're going to stay in today's value, right? So any forecast consists of 2 parts: where you eventually end up, which is what this is doing, and how you get there. Of course, in the unit root, how you get there is trivial because your final thing is the same as your starting one. But for the other 2, we need to think about how you get there. We have exponential decay. Our baseline is that 95% of the movement happens within 15 years. We tried shorter and faster, and it didn't make much difference to the graph. You'll see, it's not that the graph won't change, right? This line will change, but the new line would be kind of like pretty close to it, really close to it. So.
Sorry, I know you said that you don't trust your model to tell us exactly what the level is.
Yep.
But have you tried checking if the empirical measures, the Holstrom Williams one, give you a picture that is similar to this one that the model delivers, not on the levels but on the change?
We haven't yet, but we should. That's a good point. In the previous version of the model, we had that stationary equilibrium thing every time. And so we're still kind of going through generating a lot of results with this one. But that's a good point. We should compare the shape of this part to the statistical estimates that the RBNZ already has. Okay, so we play around with how people forecast. It doesn't seem to matter too much with any of these reasonable variations. But if anyone has a specific idea as to how we should think about people forecasting, I'm interested to hear it. But the only other paper that's doing this repeated transition paths just does this unit root thing. Okay. How do the parameters matter? We haven't done sensitivity analysis yet in the version where we solved the repeated transition paths. What we have done, though, is in the earlier version of the paper, we were just solving the final stationary equilibrium each time and ignoring the transition. And in that, we changed every parameter, increasing and decreasing them all one by one and resolving the whole path for the thing. Well, no, we just solved initial and final, but there were 3 parameters that mattered, as mentioned before. Sigma, which is the CES utility parameter. This is the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. That's why it's important. Phi 2, which was that elasticity of the net foreign position to the interest rate differential. And beta, the beta is set by calibrating to K over Y. So we change the K over Y target rather than the beta, which implies a change in the beta. Right? But a reasonable change in the beta for a reasonable change in K over Y. And that was also important. Okay, so if we were to change any of these 3 parameters in the model, that path would look a bit different. It's not going to say that the drivers are necessarily different in their importance, but the actual path that we get will change a bit. So open questions or extensions, that's essentially all of the results that I've got for today. I'm just going to go into 2 things that we're working on at the moment. So the first one of these things that we're working on is this issue about marginal product of capital and natural rate of interest. In our model and in all the other models in the structural literature, they're just set equal. And this is clearly, this to our mind is one of the big issues or problems with the model. And so we wanted to try and at least go some way to getting some progress on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to set that the government one is the capital minus theta. We then put that into all the equations of the model and get all of the returns to add up based on the idea that the government is held by people for some reason that we're not going to model, and everybody holds the same proportion of government debt to capital that's in the aggregate economy. Right, so we just assume they're all holding that average proportion, and then we adjust everybody's rates of return downward by the fact that they're holding a bunch of government that returns lower. What we then would like to do is add theta as an additional driver. So theta here is a convenience yield, and we can then have that the convenience yield changes over time. So we've looked at the finance literature on estimating it. We think we might be able to get a time-varying estimate of the convenience yield, but maybe not. But we need to, that's something that we want to do. We can certainly do it in the model. That's not a problem. But we need to find some evidence on how this convenience yield has changed over time. And then we want to run that through the model. You might think, why don't we endogenize the convenience yield? Essentially coming back to what is it representing: risk premium, term premium, liquidity premium, some combination of those are the things that most people think as this convenience yield. Getting any of them in here essentially requires some form of extra risk, which massively complicates solving it. So we don't think that's a plausible option to try and get that actual risk of micro-found this convenience yield. Instead, we'd rather try to find empirical measures of the convenience yield, run those through our model and see how important that is as the driver alongside the ones that we've got.
There's a paper by Rice.
Ricardo, right?
Yes,
Yep.
that shows that there are more than one, there's more than one R star. And he has a point in which he says that there are two types of natural interest rates, one that can be government bonds,
Yeah.
another that is capital, that comes from capital, and they coexist in the long run because there's a friction, and
Yeah.
he uses a parameter, and that should be relatively easy to motivate this
Yeah.
moment.
So his empirical measures are essentially this marginal product of capital, empirical measures of the marginal product of capital. There's people have been through the US national statistics to try and measure it directly. And then on the other hand, that the average real exposed return on interest rate. So it's talking about the exact same concept that we're trying to get in here. We just want to put it into a model and have this change over time. We can't use his numbers because they're not New Zealand numbers.
No, I just consider.
It's the exact same question essentially, though.
But I think you can like microphone a little bit that thing that way. Because there's a friction that makes these two interest rates to be different.
But then even with a friction, why does anyone want to hold the lower interest rate? Because we also, if I just had a friction, nobody will hold the government debt if I just put its interest rate lower.
His point is that in the long run, those frictions are still there.
Yeah.
We would like to hold both.
But then if I do that, I'm just going to have a utility of holding the government thing, right? And then I change the utility, but how do I measure the utility? I feel like I'm better off just to change this number rather than put in a friction and a utility for holding the government bond. So you still want to hold them even after the friction. Because, the explanations I've heard of this convenience yield are risk premium, liquidity premium, term premium, and they're all really hard to get into the model.
Yes.
So at least as a first part, we didn't want to not answer this question. We wanted to kind of also just to highlight the important difference here. And we felt that this was what we came up with that we could do, essentially.
There is this paper in Friday and volume where they show that more than actually this premium, in order to explain this divergence between the APK and the natural interest rate, they have a story that is more related to market power.
Okay.
That's saying that, okay, it's not, there is risk premium. That's the reason why some agents want to actually buy a safe asset rather than put it in productive capital. But on top of that, and actually what they find empirically is that the more important driver is market power, like that parents don't want to extra invest because they have market power and they prefer to keep it that way. No?
And that drives the private one up.
Exactly. I don't know. It's totally outside this question I'm referring to. This empirically, it seems that market power is actually at least as good as a liquidity premium to as a driver to explain this.
Can you please send me that paper? Sure. Just the email. Thanks. I'll read it and think if we can do that. So our second one, I don't know how it works here, but at RBNZ, when there's a discussion paper published, it goes to the Monetary Policy Committee and they discuss what's in that paper. So for my colleagues who are in the research unit, this is their chance to raise items with MPC that they think are important. And one of the things they wanted to emphasize to MPC is natural versus neutral. It's also, I mean, we think it's just important in general, right? You care about these two and they are distinct. So we wanted to get it's going to be a slightly back of the envelope way to get it in. The distinction arises very naturally in a sticky price model, but we don't have sticky prices, so it won't arise naturally here. So what are we thinking about doing? We're going to put changes in the net foreign position, which is to say the capital account, that is proportional to some kind of inflationary pressure. And then we're going to think about how much you'd have to change the interest rate to cancel out that inflationary pressure. And that will give us a measure. I'm not going to claim this is a great idea, but I am going to claim it's a step in the right direction. Just to have the distinction in the model, because currently all of these structural models just have this and ignore that. I shouldn't say all. The new Keynesian ones where you're looking at infinite horizon, new Keynesians have the distinction, but all the OOG models ignore the distinction, and we'd like to have that distinction at least to remind people of the distinction. Okay, so summing up, we build this small open economy model, OOG model. We solve these repeated transition paths because we want to understand what are the drivers of the natural rate of interest in New Zealand. Since the year 2000, we found two main things: slowing productivity growth and world natural rate of interest. One is domestic, the other one is international. And if you want to do this, we've made code a bunch easier. All right, that's it. Thank you all very much.
Something final. So which one do you think the central bank should care about? The natural or the neutral? Like,
I think they should think about both when they're trying to set. Maybe the neutral is a little bit more important because New Zealand Central Bank is is a single objective bank with inflation targeting, and so if you're a single objective bank with inflation targeting, I have to say the neutral rate. If they were a dual mandate bank, maybe it's the natural rate, but as a single mandate bank, it's got to be the neutral.
that as a reference for the interest rate of the central bank, it should be the neutral, not the natural.
If you are interested in inflation, if you're interested in employment and output stabilization, maybe the natural one is also interesting because it kind of has that output side to it, right? The neutral one's just an inflation thing, and the natural kind of has an output side. So I'd kind of say if you're in the case of RBNZ, it's the neutral because they're a single mandate central bank. But if you are a dual mandate, maybe you should care more about the natural, or at least both of them.
And do you know how different they are, like the estimates that they do? Just if you know, if you don't know.
No. I know they estimate them quarterly because when we did the first version of the paper, we solved the model quarterly so that it fit with the suite of models that they had. But I don't know, other than the fact that it's done quarterly, I can't tell you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.